Yeah.
Good evening. Good evening. I may be a couple minutes early, but you're here. Thank you for ignoring the snow squalls and joining us tonight. I'm Mike Ehrman. I'm president of this group. I've been missing for a couple of months, and it's nice to be back and see people. We're a voluntary organization with a voluntary board of directors, and the first thing I always want to do is introduce the folks who help run this group. We have Betty Connolly, one of our vice presidents here. Betty edited this first book that we put together a number of years ago. We have Helen Wilson in the back. Helen does many things, but edited the second book, both of which are for sale. Wayne Bossinger is a board member. Audrey Whitman is a board member running the camera. And I want to see if I missed anyone who's here tonight. Anyone? No, I think that's the membership or the board that's here tonight. We do monthly programs for those of you who are new, and you've been given a sheet reminding you of the programs to come. Next month we're doing the trolley lines in the East End. George Gula, who was working with the trolley system and has done work with the Western Pennsylvania trolley system, is going to be with us. In May, we're doing something a little different. We've had some real good success with talks about universities, and there are a lot of Penn State alum in this area. So we've got the archivist from Penn State coming down to talk about the history of that college. She's coming pretty far, but we're excited to do that. There's a film that the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks put out about the history of the citywide group that we are not formally affiliated with, but we do things together. They'll be here in June, and you can get the rest of the talk there. We do walking tours, and we have sign-up sheets for two of them. One in May, mid-May, CMU. We did this last year. It's one of the best walking tours we've ever done. Urge you to sign up for that. Take a form. We also have, you're truly running a tour of the Squirrel Hill Business District the first Saturday in June. And we'll wander around, we'll probably do a mile or two wandering through and seeing key highlights of the business district development. So please consider that. A couple of other things I want to bring up to date in terms of us. Some of you contributed to our newspaper project to get the Squirrel Hill News digitized. It is, and if you use the Pittsburgh, go on to, what's it called, Pittsburgh?
Historic Pittsburgh.
Historic Pittsburgh,
It's
you can
University of
begin to work with those newsletters. In about a month, we're going to have access to the newsletters directly through our website, but you can begin to look at them now, and it's an exciting moment. We made a contribution to Pitt today to defray them for the lot of work they did to get that ready. This is a very significant step, because this group has done many good things. We have not been in a position to get down to the level of answering questions about individual streets and the history of individual buildings, and now you're able to search to get that kind of information, so we're very excited. Our website was redesigned 3 or 4 months ago, and we keep building. I urge you to look at squirrelhill.org or squirrelhillhistory.org, because there are a lot of new features with more coming. For those of you who are members, we will release a password in about a month so that you'll have access to some special member pages only on that website. We have books to sell. We have the membership drive, our 2018 membership drive is ending the end of the month. We welcome, there's some people who haven't renewed, I don't know if there are any here, and we welcome new members. That's what keeps us going. We are in good cooperation with a number of historical groups around the area, and one of the most is the Lawrenceville Historical Society. They've come to talk to us, and there's some cross memberships. And on March 21st at Carnegie Library on Fisk Street in Lawrenceville, Mary Lynn Gutowski, who spoke here on the mansions of Pittsburgh, is going to give another lecture on the mansions. She was like us, an Arcadia publishing client prepared. And so that is going to be a Wednesday at 6:30 down at the Carnegie Library on Fisk Street. And now let's come to our evening program. Elisabeth Roark, who's with us tonight, is an old friend of this organization. Matter of fact, if you look at this book, the old book, the Arthur Smith collection from Chatham, has contributed for free a number of the pictures that were in this first book. And the way this all happened is that we were having an outdoor exhibit at the Squirrel Hill Happening, and we had a table, and Beth came by one day and said, you know, I have access to a lot of pictures of Squirrel Hill, you know, feel free to use them. And there we were. Beth has come back a number of times to talk about Chatham. She's helped lead a tour of Chatham for us twice, I think. Yeah. She's helped with our Homewood tours and given a series of lectures for us. She's an associate professor of art history at Chatham, runs a number of their art history programs, and also supervises the university art collection. So our dear friend Beth, please come up and talk tonight about what sounds like a very interesting topic.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it, and thanks for coming out again. The weather's been so strange, but I'm glad you made it. And right now, I don't think it's snowing at this minute, so hopefully it'll be okay for the next hour or so. A little bit about my background. People always say, how did you get into studying cemeteries? Because it's not the most common of research topics. It's a little bit off. It's kind of a niche subject. And I was in graduate school at Pitt in the 1980s working on my master's and then my PhD. And we had a visiting scholar from, I think it was University of, was it Boston? I think Boston University, who came to give a seminar on funerary sculpture. And I'd always been interested in cemeteries, and it was, you know, walking around them, seeing what was there. And everyone in the seminar picked someone famous to work on, like Michelangelo's tombs or Bernini's tombs. I always like working on things that I can see, and I said to the professor, you know, I really like to work on something that I can see. And she said, well, you know, out in Lawrenceville, there's one of these prototypical rural cemeteries or garden cemeteries. And I'd never heard that phrase before. She said, go check it out and see what interests you. And this is like 1983-ish, so some years ago. I went out and I just fell in love with it. I felt like I wasn't even in the city. It's the same feeling if you walk around Homewood Cemetery. You know, it's very, just a very different kind of atmosphere. And as an art historian, what interested me most was the figural sculpture, particularly at that time, images of women. So I wrote a paper on images of women in cemetery sculpture, and then it evolved into my master's paper, which was on images of angels, specifically in 4 rural cemeteries, and I'll talk a little bit about the rural cemetery movement in just a minute. So I did my master's paper. It got kind of a mixed reaction from my faculty. About half of them were like, this is great, this is so unique. You know, never had anybody work on this before. And the other half were like, this is not art, with a capital A, art. So I decided to do something more mainstream for my PhD. I worked on self-portraiture and images of artists, but when I got to Chatham and had my choice of a research subject to, you know, I had my own choice of what I wanted to work on, I went back to the cemetery material. So I've been working on this since the late 90s, started in the mid-80s, had kind of a hiatus, and then got back into it in the mid-90s. And things have changed dramatically. When I first started working on this, there were maybe 2 or 3 books on 19th century cemetery sculpture and 19th century cemeteries. Today, it's a much bigger field. There's multidisciplinary texts. Actually, I'm leaving tomorrow to go to Philadelphia to give a paper at the 19th Century Studies Association on a panel called, I named it, A Tomb with a View. And it's about kind of vistas. I'm comparing Italian cemeteries and American cemeteries. So the field has just exploded since I got into it, which is very satisfying to see. And tonight I want to talk about my process of discovery. This is an angel, the Porter angel, that I was introduced to back in the early 80s when I was working on my master's paper. When you walk around Allegheny Cemetery, you really can't miss it. It's the biggest angel that's in the cemetery. I brought an image in to give you a sense of scale. So there's me. I'm about 5'1", and the angel, I think I estimated probably it's from its hem up to the top of its head is probably 9 feet tall. And its wingspan is even wider. Its wingspan probably 10 feet tall. And to the tip of the cross from the back, probably 20 feet tall. So it's the biggest angel in Allegheny Cemetery, and it just knocks you out. You can see it from a distance, as you can see there in that shot. And at that time, Campbell Horrigan, which was a local monument-making company, still had a branch right across from the cemetery. So I went to talk to one of these old Italian stone carvers who still made cemetery monuments in the traditional way. You know, today everything's done with lasers. And he said, oh, the Porter angel, there's a great backstory there. He said, it was originally in marble. And I said, oh, really? Because it's, you know, bronze now. And it was made by an Italian. And it was so delicate that they used to cover it with a box in the winter because Pittsburgh's air was so bad and the marble began to wear away. So eventually the wings fell off, which I've confirmed in my research. It's not just a story anymore. They had it shipped to New York and recast in bronze. And I said, oh, interesting story. And I included it in a footnote in my master's paper, but then kind of forgot about it because I was working mostly on mid-19th century material. So getting back into this though, again, research is often involves serendipity, just like things you happen to stumble across or find. This story has a lot of serendipity in it as well. But it's a process that took me to Milan twice, and introduced me to an international group of scholars who work on Italian cemetery sculpture. And it also brought me back to Pittsburgh and provided more insight on art collecting in the city around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. So this is actually the first time I've added that art collecting angle. I just published an article on this, but it was in an Italian-American academic journal, so it's much more about the Italian kind of thing. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about Porter and his collecting here. So if I start running long, you know, I do want to leave time for questions. So I'm not quite sure how long this will last, but I'll try to get through it. Okay, so again, it's a striking sculpture. It's in the cemetery, and it's actually signed, which I noticed when I have no compunction about climbing on cemetery monuments. So I climbed up the steps. If you can see, there's much greater than life-size steps, 3 steps. And I climbed up there, and right down here, kind of at the base or the hem of the gown, there are 2 inscriptions. One says Enrico Booti, Milano, and I want you to notice how Booti is spelled. It's B-U-T-I, Milano. And I thought, oh, well, that's unusual because of most cemetery monuments, I'd say 99.9% are not signed. Even the most beautiful sculptures, people don't, think of them as kind of individual creative works of art. So that was interesting. And then next to it, I saw Kunst Foundry, New York. So I was, okay, an artist from Milan, but it was cast in a foundry in New York. That struck me as odd, but I thought again about this story about it being recast in America after it fell apart. So I Googled, well, actually there wasn't Google back then, in the 80s, but I looked for Booti in a lot of the literature that I could find and had no luck at all. And when we finally did have the internet and I got back into this, I Googled Enrico Booti, nothing came up. I thought, oh, it's probably some obscure sculpture that, just did this monument or just didn't do a lot of sculpture or something like that. So, and I would look online about the Porter Angel, and you can do this. If you Google Allegheny Cemetery, the Porter Angel is one of the first things that you'll see, particularly if you check Google Images. If you go to Google Images, it's a very popular subject for photography. And just about, well, let me just say, there's nothing accurate in what you're going to read online about the Porter marker, and there's reasons for that, which I'll explain. It's usually attributed to a woman named Brenda Putnam. Keep that name in mind, even though it's signed clearly Enrico Booti, Milano. And it's usually dated to the late 1890s. And it's the material is often cited as wrong. Actually, it's wrong on the, I should have mentioned this to Mike, the Wikipedia page you pulled the little blurb from, that's wrong too. So it says it's a bronze made after a granite original, and on Wikipedia, and it's not, it's marble. So again, don't believe everything that you read online. And it always really confused me. Why such differences in terms of date and who made it and what it's made out of? And once when I was browsing at Caliban, which I love to do because it's such a, they've got such great stuff, I ran across a book called Artwork of Pittsburgh. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it. It's like a 12-volume series that was published by a Chicago press in 1893. And I was leafing through it and I found this image. It just says, a monument in Allegheny Cemetery. And if you look closely, can you see the things that are different about it if you compare the two monuments? Anyone?
This one is draped and that one isn't.
Well, the sculptures are almost identical.
The cross is different.
Yeah, the cross is different. You notice there's a line under the cross bar that's really prominent, and there's also a split in the step right there. And it's black and white, but the angel looks roughly the same color as the cross. It doesn't look bronze. And again, I'd heard that it was marble, but this was confirmation to me that originally it was in marble. And something had happened to it. And it also suggested to me that it was installed before 1893, and every date that I read had put it into the late 1890s. So that I found that, and again, I was working on other stuff, and I kind of filed it away. And then I was looking at cemetery documents. I've spent a lot of time in their archives at the cemetery, and one of their guidebooks had this page, not guidebook, one of their annual kind of books on the state of the cemetery. And you can see the same kind of thing, that it's got that crossbar, it's got, can't see it very well, but it's got the split in the step, and the cross and the angel are essentially the same, look like they're pretty much the same color and made out of the same material. So I had this very striking sculpture in bronze and granite. The cross is granite now, the angel is bronze. And then I had early photographs that suggested, and this old Italian stone carver, that it was originally white marble. And again, I kind of sat on that, didn't know what to do with it until this book was published in 2007. And it was the first, it's called A Legacy of Love, Italian Memorial Sculpture, 1820 to 1940. And it's the first book in English about Italian cemetery sculpture of the 19th century, which again is a field that's growing and that I've been interested in for some time, because I have this theory that most of the figural works you see in American cemeteries, particularly before about 1880, are coming out of Italy, because we just didn't have the sculptors, we didn't have the materials, we didn't have the training for sculptors. So I've been doing a lot of, that's why I traveled to Italy, is to try to figure out how is this happening, that these works are coming out of Italy and ending up, identical works in Boston and in Baltimore and Chicago. So they're obviously kind of stock monuments. So anyway, that's my other topic that I work on. And it had, I was leafing through it, and it had a picture of this right here, fairly small picture, and I looked at it and said, oh my God, that's the Porter Angel. And it's created by Enrico Booti, B-U-T-T-I. So it's spelled wrong on the monument. So that got me very excited, and I said to my husband, okay, I've been wanting to do this for years and years, we've got to go to Italy, because now I have a good reason to go to check out this original. And again, when you see the two of them together, you can see that this is the Booti monument in Milan. It's in the Milan Monumental Cemetery, and as you can see, it's all white marble. And there's, again, I have a comparison of the two together so you can see how close they are. Though there are some significant differences, including the fact that the family name is on the Italian version. It says Famiglia Cavibusi, which they were the original commissioners of this work. And it's also in a cemetery that's very different from Allegheny Cemetery. The Italian monumental cemeteries were founded around the same time as the American rural cemeteries, and for the same reason, but their visual strategies are completely different, which is why what I'm talking about in Philadelphia on Thursday. So again, clear differences, different media, you know, bronze, granite, marble, some different details, but you know, and again, very different settings. In Allegheny, it's on a large lawn. In Milan, it's crowded among other sculptures and mausolea. So like I said, the Italian monumental cemeteries and the American rural cemeteries are both a phenomenon of the 19th century. They both developed for similar reasons. The American rural cemeteries, the first one was founded in Cambridge, outside of Boston. It's called Mount Auburn, and it kind of set the precedent. A Pittsburgh physician, James Spear, went to Boston really soon after it opened, like 1832-33, and came back to Pittsburgh and said, we need one of these. Every city really needed one of these. It was the first time the burial ground was placed away from the city and away from the church, and Pittsburgh used to have dozens of little graveyards, churchyards, and public burial grounds all around downtown. You know, again, dozens connected with every church, and then public burial grounds like the one that's over Turner Cemetery, that's over on Beechwood Boulevard. Even though it's next to a church, it's not really connected with the church. It was founded earlier than the church. But by the time, the only one that's left is the one that's between First Presbyterian and Trinity Episcopal on 6th, right across from the Duquesne Club. And you'll notice when you walk by that how high it is. They estimate that about 4,000 people were buried in that block. At first it was not, there were no buildings on it. Initially it was actually an Indian burial mound because it's set up on a ridge and didn't flood. So the Indians buried their dead there, and then when the French came in and built Fort Duquesne, they buried their dead there. And then when the English came and took over Fort Pitt, they buried their dead there as well. And so as you can imagine, you know, people have been burying people there for many, many centuries. By the 1830s, it's not in the best of shape. It's pretty foul. You have bones sticking out of the ground. You have stones being used for street curbing. It's just really, we have several contemporary accounts. James Swisshelm actually lived across the street from it and talked about it, you know, how the sexton kind of tossing bones into the corner. But it was this way in every single American city because they'd had this practice of burying near the church or in public areas. And as cities grew, the cemeteries didn't really have anywhere to go. So the rural cemetery movement was one of the reform movements of the mid-19th century. I think it's easy to understand if you think about the other kinds of reform movements of the time. This was the time when women's suffrage was really growing. Abolition, of course, was growing. Temperance, the temperance movement. This was burial reform, and it involved taking the graveyard away from this church, which was hard. They had to do a lot of marketing to get people to move away from the church to be buried. And they decided that it would not just function as a burial ground. To attract patrons, you had to have people know about it. And to attract people, you had to have an attractive landscape. So it was the rural cemeteries were the first public parks, really. People went out there. This always surprises my students because they think it's very weird to spend time in a cemetery. But this is what you did in Pittsburgh on Sunday. Was, you know, it's 3 miles from downtown. You would take a carriage out, and you would have a picnic lunch, and you would walk around and admire the monuments. And people spent time in cemeteries. Again, very foreign from our experience. We tend to deny death. You know, people die in the hospital. They don't die at home. You know, very different attitude in the 19th century. So again, the rural cemetery movement spread from Boston to New York. You can usually tell which cemeteries are rural cemetery movement cemeteries because they have nature-related names. Allegheny's a little bit different, but there's Greenwood and Laurel Hill and Mount Auburn, Woodlawn, and they all tend to be at least 60 acres is the smallest. And this was massive compared to the churchyards at the time. To Allegheny today is about 300 acres. So the biggest is Greenwood in Brooklyn, which I think is like 450 acres. So anyway, you had this going on in the United States, these large cemeteries being put up outside of the cities. And the similar thing is happening in Italy for the same reason. You can imagine in old Italian cities that were walled, you know, they had heavy walls around them, so they couldn't really move out. And Catholic tradition was to be as close to the altar or to an important relic as possible. So people were buried in the churches if you were important enough, or if you weren't, right outside the churches for a millennia. So their situation was even worse than the situation in America. At this time there was a theory of how disease spread called the miasmatic theory of disease. Miasmas were what they thought of as kind of the gases that were put out by decomposing bodies, and they thought that this was causing the cholera epidemics of the 1820s in this country, and a series of epidemics in Europe. They thought that the churchyards were causing people to become ill. And again, it was really foul over there as well, like, you know, walls breaking down and bodies tumbling out, and just as bad as you can imagine. So there was this attempt to move them away from the city. These were cemeteries that were in Italy outside the city walls. One big impetus, it actually started there in the 1740s, but a big impetus was Napoleon's period when he ruled the Kingdom of Italy. He enacted the Edict of St. Cloud, which he had done in France a few years before. If you've been to Paris, you might know Père Lachaise, which is the first cemetery of this type, away from the church and out in the country and designed like a garden. So Napoleon instituted the Edict of St. Cloud in Italy, which forbade all burials inside city walls. So again, they've been heading there anyway because of all the problems, but that was the big impetus. So you see, that's 1806 to 1809. So you suddenly see an explosion of cities establishing these huge cemeteries right outside the city walls that were often, that again, you know, were quite controversial because of the tradition of burial in among Italian Catholics. So again, same motivation, but very different in appearance. Italian cemeteries really, even though there's a good bit of nature there today, they really look like small cities. They're very crowded, and their walkways are very regimented and geometric. They're symmetrical. Allegheny and American rural cemeteries, the impression is one of nature. I mean, nature still dominates over the hand of man. You are still struck by the natural environment more so. I think this is particularly evident when you look at the ground plans. This is Allegheny Cemetery's ground plan, and this is Milan Monumental Cemetery's ground plan. So again, I mean, the Italians are coming out of a tradition of neoclassical design, which tends to be very balanced and symmetrical. They also have some of the new big cemeteries were put in old buildings that had square cloisters, old monasteries that Napoleon had gotten rid of. So they had this basic geometric organization with some variety. Allegheny and the rural cemeteries in America were based on the English garden style of landscape design, which is winding pathways, irregular terrain, hills and valleys, bodies of water, lots of trees, plants of other kinds, a completely different experience. It's the cemeteries, actually, the design of the cemeteries that inspired Central Park. Olmsted looked at Greenwood Cemetery and said, hey, let's try that without the graves. And so if you've ever been to Central Park, you know that it's a lot of winding pathways and varied terrain. Shenley Park is the same style of landscape design, this English garden style of landscape design. And it really appealed to the romantic spirit of this time, you know, getting out into nature, finding God in nature. There was a lot that, you know, a lot of things that kind of came together, and I think romantic attitudes about nature, romantic attitudes about death and mourning, Enlightenment attitudes about the importance of the individual. You know, prior to the 19th century, you weren't guaranteed any kind of permanence in where you were buried unless you were very wealthy. Most people, you know, they were buried somewhere for a year and then they were dug up and, you know, thrown somewhere else. So anyway, very different settings for these two monuments that are very close to each other. And what interests me was whether they meant something different to the people who saw them. Did they mean something different in an Italian context than they did in a Pittsburgh context? But to find that out, I had to find out as much as I could about them. And again, luckily I found that Enrico Booti was an actual person that was actually one of the leading sculptors in Milan in the latter part of the 19th century. He was the professor of sculpture at the Fine Arts Academy. He's got public monuments all over Milan. Probably his most famous is to Giuseppe Verdi. There's a monument to Verdi. He's done monuments throughout Italy. But like so many sculptors in the 19th century, their bread and butter was really cemetery monuments, both in America and in Italy. I mean, this is how they made their money. You know, you could only do one public monument to someone. You could do multiple cemetery monuments on the same theme. And Booti was from a family of sculptors in a small town called Viseu, which is very close to the Swiss border up in the Lakes region in Italy. And we were lucky enough to go up there the last time we visited. And there's a museum dedicated to Booti and his plaster casts of his monuments. So I don't think this is the same plaster cast that was used for our particular monument because it's a little bit smaller. But you see those dark marks on those dots on the wings and on the body? That was how, you know, sculpture was made in the 19th century. The sculptor would do like what was called a maquette, a small version of the sculpture, and then his assistants would come in and expand it using measuring devices to whatever size the sculptor wanted, and it could actually be various sizes. And then they would cast it in plaster and then put these point marks all over it and then use the measurements between the points to transfer it into marble. So this shows you, a working plaster from Booti's studio. You can see that the hand on the right actually still has webs of plaster between the figures because because they were so vulnerable. So anyway, this is a museum that was filled with plaster casts of Booti's work. Very small town, really the middle of nowhere, and the guy who runs this place was so excited to see me. He was like, "Oh my gosh, somebody's here to study our sculptor." He took me around the little town and was knocking on like doorways saying, "Scholar from America," you know. And this was a town in the mountains filled with stonemasons, and it was just a fascinating experience to get to know this guy who was so excited. He took me to Booti's son's house, which was being renovated, and all this other stuff. Made the trip really special. So Booti's, this was actually the angel that he was commissioned to do for the Cavi-Bussi family was the first commission that he received for Milan Monumental Cemetery. And he actually put a plaster version of it, a full-scale plaster version in an exhibition, regular kind of a citywide exhibition, and it won an award, Prince Umberto Prize. So it received a lot of attention. Then it was installed at the cemetery in marble, and Booti, again, this really kind of changed his career. He began to get commissions for more and more cemetery sculpture. There's more than a dozen works by him now in Milan Monumental Cemetery. The one on the left is, he moved from the Booti the Cavi-Bussi monument I see is kind of a transitional work, but got some characteristics of his early style. The style that he really pioneered in cemetery sculpture is called symbolism, with a capital S. We think of symbols, small s symbols, and symbolism as something a lot of art has, but there was an actual movement called symbolism. Some of the artists connected to it were Van Gogh and Gauguin, Aubrey Beardsley, Oscar Wilde. Capital S symbolism was a reaction against Impressionism, a desire to reinvest art with more kind of symbols, symbolic meaning, depth, since they saw Impressionism as kind of focusing too much on the surface. So Booti is known for pioneering the symbolist style in cemetery sculpture, which involves very evocative forms, not tremendously religious forms. Again, I work on angels, and I've never seen a guardian angel, which is the type that is, standing apart from its charge and just kind of dispassionately looking down at it. Usually angels are very maternal, and they're doing things that they do in the Bible, and that one's just standing there. And this was scandalous, as you can imagine, because he's showing the girl with, without, it's a young woman who died in her early 20s, and he's showing her undressed to the waist, but behind her is this relief that has angels coming down from heaven to collect her soul. So evocation, the symbolists believed that nothing was straightforward, that you had to kind of suggest things, and it's a complicated movement to describe, and again, most people don't know it really ever existed. So again, this was the Booti Memorial was an award-winning sculpture, but where does Porter come in? This is Henry Kirk Porter, and unlike Booti, I had no trouble at all finding information about Henry Kirk Porter. He came to Pittsburgh around, probably in the 1860s, at the invitation of his father, who gave him several $1,000s, and he developed that into a business manufacturing light rail cars. He had gone to seminary. He was a very devout Baptist and had gone to actually 2 seminaries, but he was never ordained. In between the 2, he fought in the Civil War. And again, when he came here, his father was here already, and his father gave him this money, and he had a partner, and they started this business together that was extremely successful, made him very wealthy, and also made him a prominent figure in the city. He actually had a term as a U.S. congressman from Pittsburgh in the early 1900s. And yeah, if you go over to First Baptist in Oakland, his name is all over the place. Dedicated this, dedicated that, Henry Kirk Porter everywhere. So I was wondering, one of my first kind of thoughts was, well, maybe the angel meant something different to him as a Baptist as compared to the Catholic context. That was kind of my first assumption. It was wrong, but I could never really pin down exactly what it meant to Porter himself, but I do have evidence of what it meant to other Americans who saw it. So the factory in Lawrenceville is, part of the building is still there. As you can imagine, it's been turned into loft apartments because it's in Lawrenceville, and that's what they do there now. This is a picture that I got out of, actually Jim is here tonight from the Lawrenceville Historical Society. Yeah, this is from their newsletter, Historical Happenings, and it's a picture that I just did a screen capture of because it's a really good image of, again, they specialized in light rail cars, not the really huge, heavy rail cars, but smaller rail cars, and they were in business for decades, so Porter was less involved after he became interested in politics. So I had worked with the cemetery's records in the 80s when they were under different management, and the new management, when I began to inquire about records related to the Porter Angel, was kind of resistant. Initially they said, okay, we'll do a summary for you of the documents we have, and I said, okay, I'll put up with that. And they summarized a bunch of letters that they had about the monument, and that was good. It kind of helped me learn some things about the material, but when I went to publish it, I called them back and I said, I can't have a summary written by the superintendent. I really need to see the real things. So they were very nice. The superintendent laid all the books out, the lot books, the file on the Porter Monument, and I found so much information. It was really very satisfying. One of the things that they did send me early on with this summary was the Porter's lot card, which tells me that the base or the foundation for this monument was installed in 1884. And it's the exact dimension of the lowest step. This is the base. It's unusual because it's in marble. Generally, these were made out of cement or concrete. And so A.J. Harbaugh, whose name is up there, he was a local stonemason, built the foundation in 1884, and Porter must have commissioned the sculpture before 1884 to know the exact dimensions. So this is pushing the date way back from the late 90s, or even from 93, which I saw in that early photograph. And it's still, even though it's a different monument today, of course it's still the exact same size, so the original base is still there. The base actually goes, or the foundation goes down about 9 feet. It's very deep because the sculpture is so heavy. Then, of course, the other thing that has changed since I first began to work on the Porter Monument is the internet. And I was able to go into the Pittsburgh Post Archives and Google Henry Kirk Porter and H. Kirk Porter and H.K. Porter and Henry K. Porter, everything I could think of. And I was able to find several articles about the angel. Well, they were about the cemetery, but they mentioned the angel because it was such a striking monument. And it, as people said, attracted hordes out to the cemetery to see it. This is the earliest I found in 1890, and as you can see, it's an engraving of the angel. It's kind of a weird one because the scale is way off. You see the little figure down there? It's like a little female figure on the right. It's not nearly, you saw how big it was when I was standing next to it. I mean, this makes it look like it's 40 feet high instead of 20 feet high. But here it's called The Angel of the Resurrection. It was in an article called Old Allegheny Cemetery. Next, I found an article from 1906 that actually had a photograph of the monument and was the most useful to me in terms of the information about it. This, again, it's clearly in marble here, and the article states, when it was brought to this country, it was considered the most perfect example of marble carving in any cemetery in America. And I thought, well, that could be local hyperbole, we're proud of our big angel. But it did suggest that, one, it came from abroad, that it was originally marble, and that it was recognized as distinctive. It went on to say, though, it is a great misfortune to such an exquisite piece of work that marble disintegrates rapidly in this climate. And I found out that in 1906, through the letters at the cemetery, one of the wings had fallen off. Pittsburgh's air was not, well, I should say Italian marble is not suited to Pittsburgh's air at this time. If you walk around Allegheny Cemetery and look at the older marble monuments, they have something that's called marble disease, where because of acid rain and the other kind of pollutants, the binder that holds the marble crystals together begins to dissolve. And you rub it's also called sugaring, because if you rub your hand across it, it comes off, the crystals come off in your hand like little pieces, like sugar. So that's why it's a bit of a frustration for those of us who work on cemeteries that so many of them are in industrial cities where the money was, but also where the pollution was. So anyway, I think that that's 1906 reference to the fact that it disintegrates rapidly in this climate is a direct reference to the fact that the wing fell off that year. And it was repositioned by Campbell Horrigan, and a letter at the cemetery talks about how they used kind of jury-rigged bars behind the wing to get it to stay up. I found no pictures taken of it after 1906, so I'm assuming it just got worse and worse. By 1929, the family was concerned, and the first letter came from Porter's nephew saying, what are we going to do about this? It's just falling apart. One thing I forgot to point out that I'm coming back to now. In front of the monument, as is the case in later cemeteries, usually there's a central family monument and then individual headstones. That's the style at Homewood especially, because it's a later style cemetery. This is Porter's headstone, and it reads, his dates are 1840 to 1921. Now, why would he be ordering a family, monument for the cemetery in 82? Because I found out that it took 2 years to create before it came to Pittsburgh, and we know it came to Pittsburgh around 1884. So that's a question I'm going to leave you with, and if we have time at the end, I'll talk about why a man in his mid-40s would he be ordering this huge cemetery monument at this time. Okay, so by 1931, the other wing had broken off, the angel's facial features were blurred and black, and most of the fingers had broken away. Letters in the cemetery indicate that this is when Annie Mae Hegeman got involved, and she was Porter's stepdaughter. He never had any children of his own. He married Annie DeCamp Hegeman Porter, I think in the late 70s. I've not pinned that down exactly, sometime in the 70s. And she had one daughter, Annie Mae Hegeman. They didn't have children of their own, so Annie Mae was his only heir. And so when he died, she took over and basically dedicated her life to preserving her stepfather's memory. They were very close, and there are all kinds of things dedicated to him by her throughout Pittsburgh and at museums all over the country. So Hegeman, there was a letter in the cemetery files from 1931 saying, you know, that the monument is in desperate condition. My parents desperately loved this monument. What can we do about it? And the cemetery said, really, there's nothing we can do. I mean, it's just, the marble's too soft, the air is too bad, and it's just going to keep decaying. And they actually said, and actually there's a big split across the middle, and we're really scared that it's going to break in half and fall on somebody. So we're going to take it down. And she's like, no, absolutely not. And this is where Brenda Putnam comes into the story. Brenda Putnam, I think, must have been a friend. They were in the same social circles, again, very elite social circles. The Porters had homes on Jekyll's Island, in Shinnecock, Long Island, in DC, and in Pittsburgh. And so Annie Mae, as his only heir, had tons of money. And Brenda Putnam's father was the Librarian of Congress for about 40 years. But she was a sculptor. She had gone to art school, and she'd also done cemetery monuments. This is one of her works in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, D.C. But she was born in 1890. So I knew that she couldn't have made this sculpture because it was we know that it went in around 1884. Apparently, another great serendipitous event, I'm Googling Brenda Putnam, and I find out that her archives are at Syracuse University. And I look through the list of what's in the archives, and I see that there are letters about the Henry Kirk Porter, like one name. It's listed under the K's. Henry Kirk Porter Monument. So of course I wrote to Syracuse right away and said, send me everything you have. And they sent me a whole bunch of stuff. Letters between Hegeman and Putnam, a whole memoir that Putnam wrote about the experience of working on the angel, letters between Putnam and Campbell Corrigan because they were involved in restoring the monument. It was really a great find. It was, again, one of those things that you just beg for when you're a scholar. So Putnam recommended to Hegeman that she have all of the broken parts of the angel boxed and sent to New York. And she recommended Kunst Foundry. My next slide, I don't know if you'll be able to read this or not, but she gives her two estimates. The top estimate is if she had the work done at Gorham, which would have been $16,000, and the bottom estimate is if she worked with Kunst Foundry, which was in New York City where Putnam lived, so it would have been a lot easier for her, which was only $12,000. But this is 1931. We're right in the midst of the Depression. It gives you an idea how important this monument was to her that she would go to this trouble of, again, packing it up, shipping it to New York. Kunst reconstructed it in the foundry and then cast it in plaster, made a plaster mold, and then recast, using that mold, they made a new version in plaster. But of course, everything was like broken off and not in great shape. So Putnam writes, she worked at the foundry, which was very uncomfortable because it was very hot. Her memoir is like peppered with exclamation points. It's like every other line is an exclamation point. Sounds like a very dramatic woman. She worked at the foundry from early photographs which showed its, and this is a quote, crisply modeled details. Putnam added fresh plaster to remodel, she wrote, every blurred form, every feather of the great wings, every curl of the hair, every fold of the drapery, even the mutilated hands, which she took back to her studio so she could work on them, you know, without the distraction of the foundry, because they were so delicate and detailed. When she finished, Kunst made another mold of the repaired plaster and then cast it in bronze. So what we're seeing today is, in fact, the work of Brenda Putnam, but based on Booti's work. And she said it was one of the strangest jobs she'd ever had. In 1931, she said, Signor Booti is still alive, but he's in his 90s, and he can't travel from Milan to come and work on the angel in Pittsburgh. She also wrote about what Hegeman told her about how the angel came to Pittsburgh. Let's see, I have a slide of, this is I think one of the pictures that Hegeman worked from, because she had this picture in her archives, and what she wrote at the bottom is in her hand. And again, she misspelled the name, spelled it Kirk Porter, so I don't know if there have been other scholars who've been out looking for Porter and had no luck because it was under K for Kirk Porter, which is not his name. And Allegheny, also misspelled cemetery. Made by Signor Enrico Booti, again misspelled B-U-T-I. So I think that she must have been the one who added that inscription at the bottom to, you know, pay homage to the original sculptor, but she misspelled his name. And so this is one of the pictures that she worked from, and then there was a picture taken when it was installed. You might be wondering about the cross and the steps and why they are different. They too were in really bad shape. But that work could be done locally, and it was done by Campbell Horrigan, who again wrote letters saying we really tried to preserve the original texture, but we didn't need to have that, that separate piece under the crossbar, and we made the steps whole. The steps before had a big dip in them where the angel kind of sat, and they didn't do that in the Campbell Horrigan version. So anyway, that's, why I think I had such confusion, because Campbell Horrigan made a real point to recreate the texture as closely as they could. Am I doing on time here? Okay. So Putnam remembered that Hegeman had told her about she called it their first trip abroad, where they visited the great marble quarries in Carrara, then traveled to Milan, where, quote, they met through friends the distinguished sculptor, Signor Enrico Booti, B-U-T-I. At Booti's studio, Hegeman told Putnam, they saw a 3-foot white plaster model of an angel with outstretched wings, standing with a welcoming and compassionate gesture before a massive cross. All three of them, it was Annie and her parents, Henry and Annie DeCamp, all three of them thought it beautiful, and inspiration came simultaneously to all three. How beautiful this group would be, enlarged to heroic size, carved in Carrara marble, in their newly acquired plot in Allegheny Cemetery! Exclamation point. Now, I think either Putnam got the dates wrong or Hegeman got the dates wrong, because Hegeman said the trip was around 1900, but we know that the sculpture was installed around 1894, so I think there was a little, 84, yeah, it was installed in 1884, thank you. And it's likely that, Booti's studio is right down the road from Milan Monumental Cemetery, so I can't help but think that they must have walked around the cemetery and already seen it in heroic size on the Cavi-Busi lot, where it was, I guess I never gave the date for it, but it was up there. It was installed in 1879, 1880. So it had been there for a number of years by the time, 2-3 years by the time the Porters got to Milan. And also that was the thing to do. Again, these cemeteries were tourist destinations with extensive guidebooks, with pictures, got a tremendous amount of attention in the press. It was a regular stop on the Grand Tour. So Porter's Angel, Putnam wrote, in less than 2 years, the impressive marble monument arrived in the cemetery where Campbell Horrigan Granite Company set it in place on the Kirk Porter's large and well landscaped lot. And this picture, I think, must have been taken around that time because it shows you the original dark brown patina. You know, bronze is, well, usually, well, it can range. Bronze is a metal that's made of a mix of metals, and depending on what that composition is, you know, determines the color of the bronze. It can be golden, it can be very dark brown, but if you leave it outside untreated, it gets a green patina. So that greenish color we see today is what they call a patina, which is the coating that develops on bronze when it's exposed to the elements. So this picture was taken probably in 1931. Again, you see Brenda Putnam wrote on the back of the photograph, you know, spelled the name wrong again. But it shows us how different it looked at the time it was installed, how dark brown it really was. And you can see this is the first slide I think I've shown you where you see the headstones for the family members laid out in front of the monument. So that's why I think that it's about, again, if the foundation was built in 1884 and it took 2 years for the monument to be made, I think that it was commissioned in 1882 when Porter would have only been in his mid-40s. So again, interesting to think about why you would order a monument so early when you're in good health, as far as I know. So the part of this that, again, I've never talked about in public or written about, this is the monument as it looks today. You can see that there's not nearly the kind of elegant landscaping that there was back then. Allegheny was famous for its greenhouse almost from the beginning of its history and had extravagant options for plantings. It's weird to see it like this today because the thing that strikes you when you see it in person is how high the hill is how it's up on a hill and there's a roadway below. And here the ground looks so flat. Again, I'm not quite sure what happened. I'm thinking maybe they added the road later after the monument was built and the road lowered the ground in front of it. Okay, so the part that I didn't write about in my Italian Journal article is the Porters in Pittsburgh as art collectors. Another serendipitous moment, I was at the Frick, Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Frick, doing docent training, which I do periodically when they take new docent classes. I come in and talk about the paintings at Clayton, because I used to go on tours, and whenever I would ask about the paintings, the docents would always say, oh, we don't know anything about that. So I told my friend who ran the education department, and she said, okay, you can come in and teach them about the paintings. So they bring me in every time they take a new docent class to talk about the paintings at Clayton. And I was talking about Henry Clay Frick as a collector. Most of my information came from that wonderful catalog that was done in the 1990s called Collecting in the Gilded Age. If anybody is into Pittsburgh collecting, it's a show that was generated by the Frick, and I think it was probably one of the best shows they ever did. It brought back together things that were actually owned by real Pittsburghers between about 1880 and 1920. So it gave you a really clear idea of taste in Pittsburgh, which was very conservative, to be frank. I mean, the early internationals, you know, that's why we have such a poor modern collection of Carnegie, because the early internationals were not showing modern art. So I found out, you know, I was in the docent training, and I was talking about this book and about Frick and Mellon and all these other collectors of the time, and somebody raised their hand and said, weren't there any women collectors? And I said, to be honest, I don't remember there were in this book, which is embarrassing because I've worked at a women's college for 20 years and I never really thought about it. And someone said, oh no, there's a woman in there, Annie Porter. And I said, Annie Porter, H.K. Porter's wife? And she's like, yeah, they had this big mansion in Oakland and they were big art collectors. And I was like, you know, again, bolt of lightning. I found out that Annie Porter was an artist in her own right and a very active collector. And I think she's probably behind the angel since she was there with her husband and her daughter. And the angel, I won't get into, most of my research involves why this is a new type of angel, why it was so striking, why it was so influential. But you can see that the Porters had a mansion in Oakland, on where the hospitals are now, up at the top of what they call Cardiac Hill, called Oak Manor. And that left wing was built specifically to house their gallery collection. And as you can see here, it's advertised as 2 views of the only private art gallery in Pittsburgh, and this is 1899. Now that's a big exaggeration. There were a lot of art galleries in Pittsburgh in private homes. There were a lot of collectors in Pittsburgh by this time. The way the Gilded Age book lays it out is there's a couple like right up at the top, like Mellon and Frick, who were really, really active collectors. And then there's kind of a second tier who collected, you know, probably under 100 works, but had good collections. Porter falls into that category. And again, it was his wife that seems to be the impetus. I found out, again, my field is 19th century American art, and I do have a couple different views of the gallery. Out of the way. This is the one on the bottom of that 1899 article. Unfortunately, again, these are screen grabs, so the quality is not very good. But you can see that they had quite an extensive collection, and it really was a lovely gallery space. It looks like a museum of the time. This was from 1907, so it says interior of H.K. Porter's art gallery, the finest private collection in Pittsburgh. So again, a little bit exaggerated, but it was an important collection. And I found that Annie DeCamp Hegeman Porter was instrumental in something that I knew about. Slide. Oh, there it is. That I knew about as an Americanist, you know, someone who studies 19th century American art, that she was a founder of the Shinnecock School on Long Island, which was a summer school for mostly women painters, but men as well, that was run by William Merritt Chase, who was one of the most important painters of the late 19th century. There's several works by Chase down at the Carnegie. This is his self-portrait, and this is very typical of the kind of things that he did at the Shinnecock School, which were kind of plein air, impressionist style paintings, and there's pictures of him sitting there with all these women in lovely white dresses out painting along the beach in Shinnecock. Turns out that Annie DeCamp Porter was one of the founders because they had a home in Shinnecock, Long Island, and they put up the money for the school and became very close friends with William Merritt Chase. William Merritt Chase came to Pittsburgh, painted a painting of Oak Manor, the hallway, the front hallway of Oak Manor. And again, Chase is a big name if you're an Americanist. I know he's not Picasso, but if you know American 19th century painting, you will know Chase. And this is another painting by Chase that was in Porter's collection, called an Infanta, a souvenir of Velázquez. And Spanish painter Velázquez was very influential on Chase, very brushy strokes, kind of a dark palette. And so Chase posed his daughter in the same pose as the Infanta, the princess, in Las Meninas, Velázquez's most famous painting. And Mrs. Porter bought it, and they owned it for some time. I don't know exactly where it is now. So anyway, we have her collecting works by Chase and works by other artists of the same kind of mode. Again, they're collecting in the 1890s and the early 1900s. This is well past, you know, the introduction of Impressionism and into the modern era, but again, Pittsburgh was a fairly conservative city in terms of art taste. So they seem to be very attracted to the way Chase painted, which was linked to the aesthetic movement, kind of an elite, very subtle kind of painting, very brushy, often very tonal, you know, limited tonal range in terms of palette. They also, these are both works that the Porters owned, Big Brass Bowl by Chase and John Ferguson Weir's Roses. Weir was more kind of impressionist, a little bit lighter in palette than Chase. So anyway, it was, you know, the gallery that gives the best sense of the aesthetic movement at the Carnegie is the peacock blue one that you walk into, and right across from you there's a portrait by Whistler, James McNeill Whistler of Whistler's mother fame. The whole gallery is geared around that portrait because Whistler was one of the founders of the aesthetic movement. And there's several paintings by Chase in that gallery as well. So this is something I'm excited to do more work on. When I Googled, you know, Annie Mae Hegeman and Annie DeCamp Hageman Porter, I found that they had given gifts to museums all over the country. Paintings, sculpture, but also something that struck me as kind of weird, Renaissance lace. But then I listened to a talk at a conference that said that Renaissance lace was a huge collectible among wealthy women at this time. So anyway, again, I think then that it must be, though I have no evidence for this, Annie that was kind of, you know, behind her husband saying, oh, this is a great angel. This is really different. It's kind of modern. It'll be a real, you know, stunner at our new lot at Allegheny Cemetery. And it was. I mean, it, again, I know more than you would ever want to know about angels. Like why there are 9 orders of angels and what are the angels doing. This is another monument in Allegheny Cemetery, probably the most beautiful angel I've ever seen, and why I work on angels today. It's by a sculptor whose name was actually Henry Kirk Brown. Strangely, Henry Kirk was a famous like Scottish philosopher, I think. And it's also bronze, which is a little bit unusual. This is thought to be one of the earliest full-scale bronze castings in America in sculpture. But it too has really suffered from being outside, and the green of the bronze patina has leached down over the marble, which is just, you know, you can't even read it anymore. You can barely tell what it says. But this is much more typical of the kind of angel you'd find in an American cemetery, based on classical prototypes, standing in contrapposto, hair pulled back, wearing classical garb. And Booti changed all of that. And his angel, it turns out, was highly influential. There was copies of it in various cemeteries in America. This one's in Indianapolis at Crown Hill Cemetery. I had found it way back before I started to do the bulk of this research, because my kids went to camp in Indianapolis, outside of Indianapolis. And I was, you know, driving through the cemetery. This is my husband. I have a very patient husband, as you can imagine. He puts up with this. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that looks just like the Porter angel, except the hands are wrong. The hands are like, you know, they're not like this and like this. And I thought, okay, well, I'll take a picture of it. And I could tell that the hands were replacements because they were a whiter marble. And then I found this picture when I was doing my research of the same monument, and you can see that the hands were originally just like the Porter monument hands, with the one hand doing this and the other hand doing this. And I contacted the cemetery. I said, did you replace those hands? And when you did you know that you got them wrong? and she said, no, but we found, you know, we replaced them sometime between 2007 and 2011, and then later we found this picture, which is on the Thanatos Archives, which is a death-oriented website. There were postcards and engravings, in at least 2 engravings, an Italian illustrated periodical. It's in the way here. Postcards of cemetery monuments, again, this was common because they were popular places to go. It sounds weird to us, but you can find postcards of famous cemetery monuments, you know, if you're a postcard collector, all over the place. This photographs, by the time, you know, the early part of the 20th century, you had photographs being sold of it. Alinari is an Italian archive, and they had various views taken at different times of the Cavi-Bussi monument. And copies I found online in other cemeteries that are from Booti's studio. The copies in America, with the exception of the Porter Angel, I think were done by people just copying the pictures, or, you know, maybe they'd seen the Porter Angel. They weren't done by Bouti's studio, but I found at least 5 versions that came from Bouti's studio. One, you know, there's 2 in Italy, one in Spain, which is this one, and then there's one in Argentina, and then ours in Pittsburgh. So again, this was a world, you know, well-known image, and I think that it inspired one of the most common motifs that you see in cemeteries today, the big angels, or not angels, standing in front of the rustic cross. I think that it all goes back to Bouti's monument, the Cavi-Bussi monument and the Porter monument. but someone picked it up and turned it into a stock monument, and if you spend any time in 19th century, early 20th century cemeteries today, you will see this monument repeated over and over and over again. There's one at Sewickley Cemetery, there's about 4 of them. This one's from Allegheny Cemetery. This cemetery it's popular in Catholic and Protestant cemeteries, which is a whole other big debate. So anyway, I realize I'm running over on time, so let me stop there, and if you have any questions, happy to talk about, or happy to answer them. If you have to go, I completely understand, because I know I've gone over. I get very excited about this material, which is, people think is a little weird, so I really appreciate you listening. One of the things I found very difficult about this area of study is getting it published, because there just aren't many magazines out there that are interested in this material. Though I'm the editor now of the only periodical that's dedicated completely to cemetery monuments. It's called Markers, and it is published by the Association of Gravestone Studies. If you're interested in anything cemetery related, go to their website. It's a clearinghouse of great information. Join, it's really cheap to join. You'll get a monthly newsletter of where, what talks are going on. They have chapters in many cities, not locally, but the Association for Gravestone Studies has a scholarly journal called Markers, which comes out once a year that I'm in the midst of editing right now. It was due a couple weeks ago, but I'm running a little behind, so sorry. Just questions, yeah.
A couple questions, just briefly. I noticed some of the captions, like the Granada Cemetery and the Milano Cemetery, use the single T spelling. Is that reference error only, or?
Single T spelling for what word?
I'm describing the sculpture on the Granada. If you go back a few slides, you'll see on the top of the Granada.
Oh, did I spell the name wrong?
Well, you had Booti, the name.
Booti.
Oh, okay, yeah, see?
Is that your?
That's my mistake.
And also on Milano.
Yeah, that's wrong. Again, and I've talked to people who are native Italian speakers, because I did later on try to Google Enrico Booti again, and I found one article in English, in an English art periodical, that spells it the same way. So I said, I wondered if it was a common thing for English speakers not to know that the double consonants in Italy mean a different pronunciation. And I've not been pronouncing it. I don't speak Italian or read it, which has been a bit of a challenge for this project. But when you've got double consonants, it's like you pronounce both of them. It's like Booti. And again, my Italian is not great, but yeah, see, I make mistakes too. I thought of it as B-U-T-I for so long, it's like hard for me to remember that it's
When
actually
you showed the
T.
first picture, that's how it was, when it says, the casket is cast by him. That's how it was spelled.
Yeah, on the cat, it says that. It says B-U-T-I, and that's Putnam's era, I think, because she misspelled it throughout her memoirs as well. And again, I think she probably heard Hageman say his name, but had never seen it written down anywhere, so she didn't know it was 2 T's.
And also, if you go slightly, but I collect unique Pittsburgh burial places, like Negley in the park and Brashear in the observatory. Can you add to that?
Unique ones.
One of what singular places?
Yeah, well, I'd have to think about that. Again, I started working on Allegheny back in the 80s, and I find something new every time I go there, and I go there a lot. It's really worth walking around and exploring. There's a lot of very weird stories. Again, I usually do a tour for the Office of Public Art. They like their cemetery tours at the end of October. Go figure. I think people come expecting like ghost stories, but what I give them is, I say, I'm an art historian, I'm going to talk about the sculpture and the landscape design. And I'll point out the famous people, but that's not my orientation. I'll say Stephen Foster is over there, and Harry K. Thaw is over there. But unique burials, single burials, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'll think about it. I mean, again, I've done a lot of work on Allegheny, a little bit of work on Homewood. They have their own historian, Jenny Bedford, who's wonderful, and it's actually a paid historian, which most cemeteries can't afford to do. So she's done some fantastic work on research at Homewood. She might be a really good speaker, Mike.
Two things. Were you ever able to track where the artwork from the Porter Gallery ended up?
Not as much as I had hoped. In some cases, when it ended up in major collections and it was still in those collections, I could identify a few of them, but the bulk, unfortunately those pictures are so blurry, it's really hard. to see what the works are, and I have had no luck at all finding Porter's archives. I thought that he might have records of their collection and maybe records of, you know, the thing that cemetery scholars are always searching for is someone saying why they picked this particular monument, what it meant to them. And I do have, again, newspaper accounts written by English Protestants about the Milan monument that characterize it very differently than the way it was characterized in Italy, which again, it was an odd angel for its time, but again, it influenced so many later angels. I didn't think it was that unusual until I found out that the date was as early as it was. So yeah, you can find, I mean, there's things at the Cooper Hewitt, there's things at the Carnegie, there's things at the National Gallery, so yeah.
A related question, the Mellons, were they art collectors here or only after they moved to Virginia?
No, I actually wrote the entry on Andrew Mellon for the Grove Dictionary of American Art. And it was actually Mellon who got Frick into collecting. If you read this book, Collecting, you know, in the Gilded Age, Mellon was already starting to buy when he was here and just continued to buy. Like Frick, he bought a lot of local stuff initially. Like if you go to the Frick house, you'll see work by Hetzel and by Brian Wall. When they were young men, they were collecting mostly from contemporary local artists. Right before Frick went to New York, he was just beginning to buy old masters. You know, he bought a work that he thought was by Goya, and he bought a work he thought was by Gainsborough, but it really wasn't until New York that Frick began to really invest in the old masters.
There's an interesting thing coming up. The Mellons went to Virginia, and when Paul Mellon donated a large collection of art to the Virginia Museum of Art, which is now coming to the Frick collection this month for 5 or 6 months. I've seen that collection down there, and it's very, very good.
It's very exciting that it's coming here.
So
it's
we
called
get a circle.
Van Gogh,
Mellons to Virginia to here.
Van Gogh, Degas, Monet, and it has, I mean, the Mellons were all collectors, and, you know, Andrew, you know, unfortunately, Andrew, Mellon, Frick, and a number of other people, the Phillips,
Carnegie?
yeah, well, Carnegie wasn't as much of a collector. He collected on the small scale compared to the others, but, you know, Fricks are in New York, Mellons are at the National Gallery, Phillips are at the Phillips Museum in DC, so we've lost a lot of good stuff. And like I've heard, the rumor is that it's because our museum is called the Carnegie Museum of Art. If it was the Pittsburgh Museum of Art, we'd have a much better collection. They didn't want to give their stuff to a museum called the Carnegie Museum of Art. That's why the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is a good 20 or 30 years younger than the Carnegie Museum of Art, has a far superior collection because it's the Cleveland Museum of Art. And they were, you know, they all had difficulties with each other, is my understanding.
Who were the Phillips?
The Phillips, Duncan Phillips was the name of the couple, and they started out as small-scale collectors, but then began, when they moved to DC, the museum, I think, is on DuPont Circle, or near DuPont Circle. They collected Impressionism and early modernism, and it's a really wonderful collection if you're ever in DC and looking for an alternative to the, you know, the big museums on the mall. But they were Pittsburgh-based. They were a Pittsburgh-based couple and made their money here, but then moved to DC and collected a lot in DC. And there was a show at the Carnegie when I was there, first time I worked there in the 80s, that was the Duncan Phillips collection. Their most famous paintings is Renoir's La Moulin de la Galette, giant Renoir of a dance hall. They also have a bunch of Rothkos too. They're one of the few places that has installed their Rothkos the way Rothko wanted you to experience them, which is in a small room surrounded by Rothkos, not an individual Rothko, you know, on a wall with other painters. So, yeah.
Okay, this is completely different.
Okay.
It said that to replace everything would cost $16,000.
If they
What
went with
would that
Gora.
be in today's money?
Good question. I've wondered that myself. Again, they went with the cheaper estimate. They went with Kunst Foundry, so it was only $12,000. Only
18
$12,000.
times.
So 18 times. I'm an art historian. I don't do math.
240,000 today.
How much?
240,000
Oh,
today.
wow.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's funny because both of her parents had died by 1931. And I think it was really, you know, again, getting the letter from the cemetery saying it's cracked in the middle and we're gonna have to take it down. Because she wrote back immediately and said, absolutely not, my parents loved this memorial, I'll figure out what to do. And that's when she contacted Putnam. The bigger problem I didn't mention was getting it back to Pittsburgh, because by the time Putnam was done with it, it was solid, it wasn't in pieces anymore. It was this huge bronze monument, 10 feet wide by 9 feet high, and she had the worst time finding anyone who would ship it. Eventually she found an oversized rail car, and she said they wrapped it, or it looks swaddled like a mummy. They put it on this open rail car and shipped it back to Pittsburgh. So, again, it's worth it if you're, you know, able to kind of get up on the steps and look closely at it. Again, first time I went to Milan, I wasn't doing this work, taking a lot of pictures of the monument. Second time I went, I was in the middle of my research and was able to meet with some scholars who focus on Booti, and you know, just really took tons of pictures of it. It's actually signed, the Milan version is signed as well, but you might have noticed there's a lot of growth around the steps, and I had to kind of rip away some weeds to find the signature. Yeah.
How many different varieties of angel have you seen on monuments?
Oh gosh, well, I wrote my master's paper and an article for Markers that identified 8 basic types that you see repeatedly, and 7 of those types are doing biblical things, or doing what angels do in the Bible. They're escorting the soul to heaven, they're guarding the grave. The guardian angel was a very big belief in the 19th century. So 7 of those types are doing things that angels are said to do with the Bible, very traditionally. The one type that isn't, that you see repeatedly, is the flower-dropping angel. And you may have noticed that those 2 angels that I showed at the very end were dropping flowers. I think, if you notice on the Porter monument, that it's doing this. Did anybody try to figure out what it was doing? And leaning towards that block, and in Italy the block has the family name on it. Yeah, I've had various scholars and friends say, oh, it's a this kind of angel, or oh, it's a that kind of angel. I initially categorized it as a recording angel, because recording angels are the ones in the book of Revelation who write your deeds in the book of life. And there's lots of examples of recording angels. Usually they're holding like books and writing with feathers or something. But there are also ones that are actually carving stone that fall into the recording angel category. And I think if you notice the font style in the Cavi-Busi monument, it looked like handwriting. It didn't look like real formal type. So I think it's a recording angel who's kind of inscribing the family name on that block. But the one in Pittsburgh doesn't have the name on the block. So that gesture makes no sense. It's kind of standing like this. You know, so that was one of my questions is, you know, and that's why I think it was interpreted differently here than over there. Over here, people, they called it the angel of resurrection, they called it the angel of the sepulcher, they called it the angel rolling away the stone from the tomb, you know, various interpretations. But yeah, I found 8 repeated types, but then there's a lot of like things that are unique as well, that you're not going to see. Like in Protestant cemeteries, you don't see a lot of kneeling angels, because kneeling was associated with Catholicism. So, and I focus mostly on Protestant, though I've been getting more and more into the Catholics since I've been going to Italy. But yeah, again, if you're interested, I can send you a scan of my article on angels. It's called Embodying Immortality, Angel Types in the American Rural Cemetery, which I published in 2007.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is quick side things. I don't know if you ever heard the term in French, les frics. It means sort of nouveau riche. What comes from the name fric? Because every time the frics went over there, they sort of had so much money they just could buy something and bring it back, and I think it got to be this sort of drug, term for.
Yeah.
What was the question?
She's just making a comment about
Yeah.
the term les frics,
Yeah.
which was based on the French purchasing patterns. Yeah, the funny thing about Mellon is that most people don't know that some of the best things at the National Gallery were actually sold to him by the communist government of the Soviet Union. He was Secretary of the Treasury at the time, and this was very under the table. The Soviets wanted to sell a bunch of stuff because they needed the money. And Mellon made a deal with them to buy it very cheaply. Some of the major, particularly the Renaissance works at the National Gallery, was Raphael, that came out of the Hermitage.
Right.
And the Soviets didn't care, they weren't art-oriented as in their sensibilities, but they didn't want people to know they were dealing with this major capitalist, so they kept everything hush-hush, and Mellon didn't want people to know that he was dealing with a bunch of communists, so one of the kind of nasty little stories. Yeah, the other nasty little story is that Roosevelt hated Mellon and just despised him, and he was he wasn't arrested, but he was charged and was going to go to court for, I don't think it was tax evasion, but it was something financial that he'd done. And apparently, Mellon went to Roosevelt and said, hey, I've had this idea about this gallery, this national gallery, that I would be happy to pay for if we could kind of make this other problem go away. So there you have it in the 1930s, again, during the Depression, this beautiful building being built.
That story's been pretty much confirmed.
Oh, is it? Okay. So anyway, that was part of my research for the
One or
entry
two
on
more
Mellon.
questions.
Yeah.
Did the Porters leave a will where you could have researched where they?
No, I could not. I tried I called a range of places. I called First Baptist, and just to see if they had any records of him. And he was a very, very active Baptist, in addition to, which was a little strange for an upper class individual. They actually they commented about it at Jekyll Island, because they were all Presbyterians and Episcopalians, and here's this Baptist guy. They thought that was a little bit odd. His wife and his stepdaughter were Episcopalian. And besides the fact that Porter's name is on plaques all over the building, they really don't know much about him. And I contacted Brown University, because that's where he went to school, which is a Baptist institution. They said they have nothing from him. Historical Society doesn't have anything. So I'm thinking maybe someday, there's a Porter archive that I might be able to find that can answer a lot of my questions. But no, I wasn't able to
I'm sure
find
they
the
had a
will.
list of where they wanted their paintings to be.
Yeah, you would think.
Yeah.
Again, particularly since Annie Mae kept all of the houses going. She didn't live in Pittsburgh after they moved to DC, but she always came, like Miss Frick, she always came back here to vote. She would stay at the Shenley Hotel, even though they still owned Oak Manor. And, she considered herself a Pittsburgh resident, and there was a big to-do when she died. Her will, I guess she died up in, I think, Massachusetts somewhere, and they tried to prove she was a Massachusetts resident so that they could, get the money from the will, and there was a law firm in Pittsburgh who said absolutely not, she's a Pittsburgh resident, she came back here every year, and all of this is online, in legal documents. But she seems quite an amazing woman. Again, she never married, but she just adored her stepfather and wanted to perpetuate his memory, and did a lot, both giving things to people and funding scholarships and things like that in his name. One more, yeah.
Why was it necessary for a sculptor to design this piece of sculpture as an angel with the wings spread out? Because it's not flying.
No, it's not flying, and that's actually one of the criticisms of it, is why there's a couple of reasons. If you go look at lots of angels like I do, you'll see the range. Some are up like they've just landed, some are spread out, some are down like they've been standing for a while. And in the symbolist movement, which again, I think the Porter Angel is an early kind of example of proto-symbolism. In the symbolist movement, they were rejecting religious ideas related to positivism. And positivism was a philosophy that only things that can be proved are true. So it was, right at the same time as Darwin, and religious ideas we were secularizing rapidly. And the symbolists wanted to bring back kind of at least a spiritual quality to art. And so suddenly the angel's wings got huge. And I think that's why they're such big wings. Because it's the most spiritual aspect of an angel, is its wings.
Really?
Again, there's baby angels that have little tiny wings. I've seen butterfly wings on babies in cemeteries, baby sculptures, not real babies. There's the range, and there are people that can identify the kind of wing that do that, like say this is a such and so kind of wing of a particular bird, but I don't do that. I think it was to balance with the cross myself, that was more of a formal decision than anything else.
let's cut it at this point.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Don't,
Oh, my.
we never asked for
Poor little puppies who've been sitting alone at home, so, you know. But,
Now you know why we keep inviting Beth to come and speak with us. Thank you very much. If you ever want to look for basic art research, there she is.
Yeah, I've been doing this
Thank
for
you very
a
much.
long, long time.
Listen, could you remember about our meeting next month on trolleys, books, memberships, walking tours? Take the literature on your way out, and please help us take the chairs to the corner where we'll be shown where to put them away. That's part of the tradition. We're very